Conservancy. I'm the executive director of Rock Creek Conservancy, and as you probably just saw from that pop-up box, we will be recording this program this evening. A couple little housekeeping or Zoom etiquette remarks to start. As I mentioned previously, please mute yourself. If you do not mute yourself, my wonderful colleagues Elena and Lindstrom will mute you for yourself. That just keeps the background noise to a bare minimum. Throughout the evening, you are welcome, as I said, to put any questions or comments that you'd like to share, constructive comments that you'd like to share with the panelists in the chat function of Zoom, and we will aggregate those for the question and answer period of the evening. As mentioned, I'm Jeannie Brauha, the Executive Director of Rock Creek Conservancy, and we're really delighted to co-host this series with our partners at the National Park Service at Rock Creek Park that focuses on the intersection of race, history, and Rock Creek. We hope you'll join us for future programs. If you've been at some of the earlier programs, thanks for being here. We're in for a really fantastic program this evening, and I will introduce that in just a moment. I did want to start with just a quick moment of silence. I recognize that yesterday is the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and next week is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. And I think that it would befit us to start this evening with just a moment to reflect on just how not far we've come in that 100 years. Thank you for that. So last summer, in the wake of that murder and a number of other events, Rock Creek Conservancy and Rock Creek Park launched this series to explore the intersection of race, history, and Rock Creek. We're so fortunate to have Rock Creek Park as a resource in our communities, and it is part of the history of our region. And as such, it is so intertwined with the complexities of that history. And as is clear from those events that I just mentioned, in order for us to move forward in a positive and constructive way, it's important for us to learn about, and we have really enjoyed learning with all of you as you join these programs, to learn about that history so we can make sense of it and build a brighter future together. We are incredibly fortunate at Rock Creek Conservancy as the Friends group to the entirety of Rock Creek Park to have just tremendous partners in the form of the incredible professional staff at Rock Creek Park of the National Park Service. And if your videos are on Rock Creek Park staff, I'll ask you just to wave quickly. We're trying to get to the meat of the program here. And we are so thankful for this incredible team that keeps this park, which is part of our city's heart and soul, the lungs of the city, as well as infrastructure for our city, that create this space for civic dialogue and really to capture and tell the stories of the history of our democracy, and also an opportunity for us to come together and, as I said, chart that future. We're also really fortunate at Rock Creek Conservancy to have really wonderful fellow partners to the park. And I'm delighted that this evening we are joined to tell the story of the life and times of Hattie Soul by our fellow park partner, the Friends of Peirce Mill. I will turn things over in just a moment to the Friends of Peirce Mill's Education Director, Angela Kramer, in just a moment. And I think I saw Nathan and possibly a few other Friends of Peirce Mill board members with us this evening. So thanks for joining us. I know that we also have several of my bosses, Rock Creek Conservancy board members, with us tonight. I thank them for their leadership and guidance, but perhaps first and foremost, Elena Smith and Lindstrom Terry, who are the people that get all the work done here at Rock Creek Conservancy. Let's give them thanks as well for all of the work they've done to pull this event together. And with that, without any further ado, I do want to turn things over to Angela, who will introduce our fantastic panelist of speakers. In about 45 minutes or so, when Angela says it's time, we'll switch to the question and answer period. Again, this is meant to be a dialogue that starts here, that extends into the park and into the future. So please don't be shy about putting your questions into the chat function, and look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Jeannie, and thank you to the Rock Creek Conservancy and to our partners in the National Park Service for organizing this series on race and history, and also for all that you do to make Rock Creek Park such a vibrant and meaningful place for all Washingtonians. We really appreciate having partners and friends like you all. So I'd like to begin tonight's program before we turn it over to tonight's speakers with just a little background on the Hattie Sewell Project. The Hattie Soul Project began a little over a year ago. Until then, all we really knew about Hattie Soul was what's in a few lines in the official administrative history of Rock Creek Park. We knew that she ran the tea house at Peirce Mill starting in 1920, and we knew that she lost that contract after the park received complaints from a prominent neighbor. And that was really all we knew about Hattie Soul. But because we were approaching the centennial of these events, we became interested in learning more about her story and in trying to find out who she was. Fortunately, we were able to dig up a little bit of information last summer, thanks to the work of one of our board members, John DeFerrari, who's our board secretary, and Steve Dryden, our executive director. And they found some basic information about Hattie Sewell that was really fascinating, including an advertisement that she placed in July of 1920 when she first opened up the tea house at Peirce Mill. So we realized that there was a lot of potential here to do a project around Hattie Sewell. And we also knew that there was a lot of community interest in her story. So last fall, I reached out to Dr. Amy Yeboah at Howard University, who I'm going to be introducing in just a few moments. And I was very pleased that she got back to me right away and said that she'd be very interested in partnering with us on this project. Thanks to Dr. Yeboah's guidance, we were able to create an independent study project last winter, and I got to meet Asan Hawkins and Yanava Ferreria, who I will be introducing in just a moment as well. And I really enjoyed working with them on an independent study project to learn more about Hattie Sewell. So what they'll be presenting tonight is what we've learned in the last few months, but the Hattie Sewell Project is not over because we recently received funding from Humanities DC to continue this project over the summer. And our goal is to produce a short film about Hattie Sewell, which I'll be telling you more about at the end of tonight's program. But I'm really pleased to be working again with Asan and Yanava and Dr. Yeboah this summer to complete the work we've just started. So we hope that tonight's program will get you interested in Hattie Sewell and that you'll be eager to come back and learn more in September. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Yeboah. When we started this project, we were hoping we'd find some connections to Hattie Sewell's life and times, that we'd find connections between Hattie Sewell and the time and place in which she lived. I couldn't have imagined the kinds of connections that we've found. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Yeboah with us tonight. She's an associate professor at Howard's Department of Afro-American Studies. She is a filmmaker, and she is about to publish a book on Lucy Diggs Slow, who was the first dean of women at Howard and who was also a contemporary of Hattie Sewell's. So we're very fortunate to have with us tonight someone who knows this era quite well, and she's going to give us a little bit of historical background before I turn things over to Asan and Yanava, who are going to tell us more about Hattie Sewell and the Sewell family. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to hopefully get things started here. All right, so let's see here. You should be able to see my screen. All right. Everyone can see my screen.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. I'm going to turn things over to you, Dr. Yeboah.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. And thank you to the Friends of Peirce Mill and Rock Creek Conservancy for inviting me. Great invitation and conversation between Howard University and the general DC, and also since this is digital, hopefully others outside of DC to understand the story of Hattie Soul. I first want to say I'm giving a brief history just by some context, but our students will dive much deeper. And in talking about this invitation that was given from Rock Creek Conservancy and Peirce Mills, I use a story I use in class with my students, and I say, if I invite you to my house to build something small, maybe a shed, and I said, I'll compensate you, and I didn't, and then you left. I'm sure you'll come back the next day asking for your money, the following day and the day after that, right? And if I also didn't give any credit to the work you put into, let's say, my house, you'll feel somewhat devalued. And that's what we have here, an intersection with Rock Creek Park and the people who have labored in the space and giving it credit, giving them credit and giving some value to the work that they put in. So I'm honored to have this conversation, particularly around Black women, much of the work Black women have put into allowing DC to be the space it is today. So thank you. Also want to honor the fact that when we talk about labor in the space, also now some of the Native Americans who put labor into the space known as Rock Creek Park, that we may not know their names, but we also honor the work they put into that space as well. The Austin brothers, in a report in 1883, said about Rock Creek Park, the architects of the park, said, no matter how perfect the scenery of the park may be or maybe become, no matter how high its potential value, the value remains potential except insofar as it is enjoyed by the larger and even larger number of people. So we're centered to pay context around the people, and the one person we're looking at today is Hattie Soul. Next slide. And in doing that, I am reminded in this time and space about the Howard University class of 1921. And 100 years ago, today, these same students were facing a pandemic, the influenza pandemic. They were facing some of the racial tension that was existing in DC, and they still decided to come to DC and get an education for their families, their communities, and they labored in the space that we now stay in at Howard University. And that work still continues, even though we're thinking about what's happening within race relations in America in general. That conversation has been an ever-evolving conversation where people are always reflecting upon how far we can move forward and still looking back. Next slide. So in DC, during the narrative we're talking about with Hattie Soul, we're talking about what's happening in DC in 1919. One of the major things is Red Summer. And Red Summer it's a snapshot of race riots that are happening across the country, but particularly also in DC. DC is not separate from what race relations and tensions are rising across the country. Things get very brutal, many people are murdered, but DC is a part of that heated tension around race and progress, and the sense of how do we share space post the end of enslavement and African Americans migrating more and more up north or out west. So after the end of World War II, tensions do rise, and in DC, in the space that we find ourselves around Rock Creek Park, Red Summer is a part of that conversation. Next slide. Alongside the sense of African Americans leaving the South, coming up north, right, facing tension, what becomes invisible is the amount of work Black people, particularly Black women, are doing, even though they're not visible. And I like to use this picture. This picture is a picture in the center. You can't see it so well, but at the center is Lucy Big Slow. And particularly a lot of women are coming to the North, not just to where the library, also to get an education. And college educated Black women take upon themselves the responsibility to try to educate not only their people, but also contribute to the spaces in which they live. So as they're moving up north, even though they're facing inequality, the sense of not being valued, they're still getting an education. At the same time, during the same time period, the first Black woman to get a PhD graduates in 1920. But even though they're not visible, Black women are still trying their best to come together, form clubs, come together, form organizations to move not only themselves and their families forward, but to come together to move the space around them forward. And that conversation, next slide, still continues, particularly in DC with Nannie Helen Burroughs. She forms the largest woman-owned Black women organization in the nation. She's not only an organizer, not only a role model for other Black women to use their degrees to uplift individuals, but she also is a businesswoman, which centers today's conversation as far as Black women doing business. And if we really look at the labor Black women have played, the role labor has played in Black women's lives, we can also see issues of race. That in many cases, we see many Black women laboring to get an education, but not being valued or given jobs. We see many Black women laboring to organize, but not legally on paper being deemed as citizens or worth contributors in their society, but they still do it anyway, right? So in examining the work that club women who are working in higher education, women who are trying to find ways to uplift themselves and their families, some of that invisibility shows layers of racism and discrimination they deal with. Next slide. And we see that also in the work that Elizabeth Kinkley does. Elizabeth Kinkley, an African-American woman, she becomes known as a woman who sews dresses for Mary Lincoln in the White House. But her contribution, her labor, when she does make that public statement, is hidden, right? She's fired, she's ousted. The work she put in is supposed to be invisible, right? But because of race and discrimination, it is hidden, right? We look at the work that Mary McLeod Bethune does. When we talk about the Black Congressional Caucus today in DC, she was one who worked to form the Black cabinet. She works in the White House to make sure that that the voices of African Americans, even though they cannot vote, are still felt. And a lot of her work is also still hidden. Mary Church Terrell in education, the work she does in DC and in LaJoy Park, some of that is still hidden, right? So if we are able to uncover some of the work that Black women have done, we will see that their labor, right, should be given credit to how we see the larger fabric of DC. Next slide. And in connecting DC to many other things across the country, we see even today, 100 years later, we can honor the 100th anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, but we're still waiting for justice for Breonna Taylor. When we look at even in technology, 60 Minutes aired a series on AI bias. They interviewed Black women, the work they were doing, but they weren't considered a part of the airing of that conversation. Nicole Hannah-Jones, award-winning journalist, did a great job on the 1619 Project. Most recently, in National Conversations, she was denied tenure from her employer, or her potential employer, UNC Chapel Hill. And then even in DC, again, the work that has to be done around maternal health and Black women and giving birth and death rates, that's what that still needs to be done. So all in all, again, today's conversation, focusing on Hattie Soul's story, allows us to really look at some of the larger racial issues we have in society. Black women have labored, and most of their labor has been invisible around business, around research, around industry, beauty. But when we lift up their names, we also see many other issues around it. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to our students who will go more into Hattie Soul's story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yeboah, and thank you for sharing that. And I think that your comments on the too often invisible labor of African American women are very apropos of what we'll be talking about next, which is actually what Hattie Sewell did at the Tea House, her management of the Tea House. And for that portion of this evening's presentation, I'm going to turn things over to Asan Hawkins in just a moment. But first, I wanted to give a little background on Peirce Mill itself and how the mill actually became a tea house. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here, pardon the mill pun, and go back to the beginning of Peirce Mill. Peirce Mill was built in 1829. It was part of a much larger plantation. The Peirce family also had a sawmill, they had a nursery business, and all of these enterprises were in part run by enslaved people. The Peirce family enslaved people here in DC up until the Civil War. And that's an important part of this story. The mill continued to operate as a grist mill, meaning it was a place where people ground flour or ground wheat and corn into flour and cornmeal until the late 1890s when the operations of the mill ceased. By that time, Peirce Mill and the Peirce estate had become part of Rock Creek Park, and it was decided that instead of restoring the mill, the building would become a tea house. So in 1905, that's what happened, and Peirce Mill was a tea house for almost 30 years. A series of managers operated the tea house, including Hattie Sewell, who took over the concession in 1920. And I'm going to turn things over in a moment to Asan Hawkins. But before I do, I'd like to just introduce Asan. I've had the privilege of working with Asan these last few months, and I'm excited about continuing to work with her and Yanava this summer. Asan is a recent graduate of Howard University. She studied both Afro-American studies and she was pre-med. And I just found out that she's also an EMT. So we're very honored to have Asan join us this evening and to tell us a little bit about Hattie Soul and some of the information we uncovered during our independent study project about the operation of the tea house and who Hattie Soul was. So Asan, I'm going to turn things over to you. Please just have me forward the slides whenever you're ready.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Angela. It's been amazing working with you as well. You can go ahead and turn to the next slide. Before I get into the meat of the Hattie Soul story, I think it's very important about what Dr. Yeboah said in the historical detailing of Washington, D.C., that we need to acknowledge that the restoration of African-American history and African-American women is solely important. These lost narratives are something that we should definitely continue to uncover, and I've been so lucky to get to do that after I graduated. Usually in terms of the 1920s, which is when Hattie Soul is operating this tea house, we have narratives of ownership that are in the white male gaze. So you see ownership in the United States as being solely white and male, so the Rockefellers. But Hattie Soul is developing her tea house at this era too. She is representing ownership for both women and African Americans in DC, and that's very important. But what's more important is to understand the environment that is conducive to her becoming an owner in the first place. So we have to go back a little bit. Hattie Soul was born in Dallas, Texas in the late 19th century. She is a participant in what is known as one of the greatest migrations in United States history of African Americans from the South into the West as well as the North. While participating in that migration, she finds herself in Phoenix, Arizona. She marries her first husband, J.W. Bolton. As you can see on the right on the slide, J.W. Bolton actually owned a business. He was a business owner himself. So Hattie is in an amazing position where she is married to somebody who she sees running a business, operating and owning. So it's not out of the picture for her to have owned a business herself. She is in an atmosphere that allows for that. But not only is she a wife, she is a mother. Her son, Chauncey Bolton, was one of the only African-American students at an Arizona school for music. To your left, you'll see his composition. It is highlighted at the bottom. And so you see her husband owning a business and her son operating in recitals, and you come to the conclusion that Hattie Soul herself is a middle-class African-American woman, which also gives her an advantageous position in order to own the tea house, because with that ideal, like I said, she's been put in a position to be operating with other African-Americans who also would have businesses in that area. Hattie did also in Arizona stay in a predominantly white neighborhood, which is important. It meant that she was able to operate her business in a atmosphere that wasn't necessarily all African-American. And that's very important at this time. As we know, race relations are more seen as segregated, but she has been operating in a way that she could both interact with white Americans and Black Americans without any deficits being occurred. Next slide. Unfortunately, her husband did die in 1902, according to the records, I'm sorry. And she ends up marrying a soldier who my co-speaker Yanava will be talking about later, so I'll pretty much gloss over it. Samuel Soul, who is a soldier. And because he is a soldier, that causes them to also move again. And so they kind of migrate up north to Iowa. And then in 1919, they find themselves in Washington, D.C. Next slide. Now that we're up to Washington, D.C., we do have actual proof that she is also, her mother is coming to see her in D.C., so that definitely helped us situate herself there, where she was living with both Chauncey and her husband. To your right, you will see a picture of the estate at which she lived at during the time. Her mother is very influential also in her life, as she is a middle-class woman as well. She ends up marrying the only African-American veterinarian in Phoenix, which also gives you an ideal picture of the background that she's coming from. Next slide. In October of 1920, Hattie ends up winning a federal contract in order to operate the tea house. She did do it legally, as it was a legal process. And one of the bigger questions is, if she's operating in a predominantly white neighborhood where segregation is not allowed because it is Washington, D.C., it operates under the federal government, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would not allow for the type of segregation that you would naturally see in the South to occur. But segregation was something that was implied because of the times that we were in, or that Hattie was in. But yes, so she wins the federal contract for $45 an hour. To your left, you'll see a picture of the advertisement that Angela had mentioned earlier about her owning the tea house. And she ends up operating that tea house, and we don't really have a clear picture of what the inside of it looked like at the time, which is one of the things that is sad. But luckily, a wonderful work has been done, not a lot, but some, on what African-American tea houses would have looked like at the time. So to your right, you have a picture of an ideal tea room and what it would look like. At that time, tea houses were based off of traditional British culture. And so you see very quaint, very put together and structured seatings, as well as decoration. It's very elaborate, more so suggesting a middle-class life. Unlike traditional tea rooms in the white community, however, tea rooms in the African American community operated by letting both male and female participants in, and even more, one of the greatest things I discovered while doing this research was that a lot of activist clubs, or societies, as they would be traditionally known at that time, would come into African American tea rooms and operate. So then we're also situating not her only being in a tea house, but her running a tea house that is based in activism. And later on, I will explain how even the tea house itself is its own form of activism. Next slide. So during Hattie's running of the tea house, it's important to note that business had increased by 200%. She ran the tea house well. When you gain a federal contract, there are steps that you need to take in order to gain that. You need to have a formalized business plan. You need to have former business experience. So she was very well put together. And by the increase, we understood that she had a wonderful and successful business within this area. And if she had to do it, she did it well. That's what the title of this slide is. But more importantly, it's that title, because if you look to your left, most African-American women in the 1920s were domestic workers. That was the highest percent. That is mostly the areas that African-American were to work in. So she is put in this box, but she exceeds expectations. She exceeds what people thought African Americans were supposed to do, or even women. We were not supposed to own and operate businesses. We were not supposed to be able to be successful at most things, as we still think education is the first step. But Hattie being able to do this and do it so well, that is activism to me, because it's her actually taking this image of white male ownership and saying, hey, even though I am not in the mainstream of what it means to own and operate, I'm still able to do it. And I need you to know that African Americans, women or men, are still able to own and operate these businesses and do it well, which is very, very important. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, after only 1 year, Hattie was running the successful business. A descendant of Peirce Mill, who is not a direct descendant, but an in-law, saw Hattie's successful running of the business and was not particularly happy that a Black woman was running a successful business on what Angela had mentioned was an ex-plantation. To do so in any sense would be outrageous. In its earliest conceptions, Peirce Mill was never supposed to be operated by someone that they didn't even see as human. When E.S. Newman filed the complaint, one of the things that he said, which is also in the actual history of Peirce Mill, if you go on the website and when you registered for the event, you also saw this. He was quoted as saying that the tea house was a rendezvous for colored people, soon developing into a nuance. Now, we saw where it said that she had a 200% increase from the previous owners who were not African American, but were white women. And so for him to suggest that somehow her business was going to make the property value go down or make people uncomfortable just wouldn't align with the actual information and the facts that we have received. Unfortunately, because of the complaint, it was brought to Hattie's attention, and Hattie conceded the federal contract in July of 1921, and she ended up not being in possession of the tea house at Peirce Mill.
Thank you very much, Asan. And I just wanted to highlight again something that Asan was just speaking about, and that is that, that running a successful business is a form of activism for African American women. It's something that I've kept in my mind as we've been working together on this project about Hattie Soul. So now in just a moment, we're going to shift gears again to talk a little bit about Hattie's husband, Samuel Soul. And Samuel Soul was the reason why Hattie Soul was in the DC area to begin with. She and her husband were not DC natives, but they came here when Samuel Soul was stationed at Camp Meade in the years leading up to World War I and as World War I was beginning. So to tell us a little bit more about Samuel Soul, I'm going to turn things over to Yanava Ferreria in just a moment. Yanava is a rising junior at Howard. She is also majoring in Afro-American studies with a dual major in philosophy. So we have two very accomplished students, and I've enjoyed working with Yanava as well. And she is joining us today, I believe, from the other Washington. So from all the way across the country, I'd like to introduce Yanava Ferreria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Angela. I'm going to be introducing you to Hattie Sewell's husband, Samuel Sewell. And so in researching Hattie Sewell's life and her legacy, we found information on her husband. And I mean, we felt that it was important to include him because he is her story. And he also attests to being a Black man in America in the 20th century. And so we wanted to set some context like for her life, and part of that context was including the story of Samuel Sewell. So as you've seen and as you will continue to see, Hattie and Samuel were extraordinary people. They were involved in the community, and as Asan was talking about, activism. But as evidenced by the success in DC, in like the U Street area and just the Black community in general, that wasn't unique to them. Like there were so many remarkable people, and they're just part of that great legacy. So next slide, please. So Samuel Sewell was born June 1st, 1877 in Noonan, Georgia, and he was actually a U.S. Army captain, and he was a Buffalo soldier in the 368th Infantry Regiment. And then he moved to Arizona, as mentioned before, and he was stationed at Fort Huachuca, and he went there around 1915. And Fort Huachuca was known as the home of the Buffalo Soldier. And then they were married there in Tucson, Arizona. And then next slide, please. Thank you. And then they moved to Fort Des Moines, Iowa in about 1917, where he was stationed there. And then as you can see, there's a kind of grainy picture, but that's actually an image that we found of Samuel Sewell. Next slide, please. And then he was stationed in Fort Meade, Maryland, which is how they actually got to DC. So next slide, please. Thank you. So Samuel Sewell was actually discharged from the military in 1918, but right when he got out, he actually created an organization called Grand Army of the Americans. And this organization aimed at uniting Black war veterans. And also a newspaper article that we found said that the organization also was meant to promote democracy in the United States and also the welfare of its members. So yeah, the organization was really involved in the community. There were many newspaper clippings over the years that we found that mentioned the organization. So for example, there was a Washington Post article in 1919 about one of their meetings at the YMCA, and a professor at Howard University, an attorney named William H. Hart, actually spoke there to the organization. So that's just like some examples of like how involved the organization was. And then I think this just really shows that Samuel Sewell not only served in the military, but he also served his community in DC. And I think that points to the prominence and just the drive of the Sewells, both Hattie and Samuel. And it shows that they really cared for their community and they chose to take action to uplift it. Next slide, please. So Dr. Yeboah talked a little bit about Red Summer in 1919. So basically, African Americans loyally joined the war effort in hopes of obtaining citizenship, but then when they came back, they faced violence from white Americans. And so on the left here, you'll see a headline from the Washington Herald during Red Summer. And at the time, there was large-scale press coverage with headlines spewing this narrative of Black men attacking white women. And so I think, yeah, this headline kind of is like a typical one that you would have seen during the time. And then on the right is a Washington Times article from July 11th, 1919. And it actually is about Samuel Sewell. And he has a quote here, which is awesome that we were able to find. And the article just basically describes how the Grand Army of the Americans issued a quote unquote declaration of war against those who have been assaulting women, as well as the other crimes that were occurring at the time. And then Samuel Sewell goes on to say that the colored manpower of Washington is ready to recruit Major Pullman's army. And we believe that the Major Pullman that he's referencing is Raymond W. Pullman. And he was a major and superintendent, and he was also known as the chief in Washington, D.C. from 1915 to 1920. And then so basically he was just saying that they're ready to defend the victims of any of the crimes that were occurring. And so when I first read this article, I was thinking about it in the context of what I know about Red Summer. So it was white mobs attacking Black communities all over the country, and how the African American community, particularly African American war veterans, organized and protected their communities. But then Samuel Sewell, he said in the article, "We won't stand by and allow our race's reputation to be outraged." And so in reading the article again and just reflecting a little bit more about it, I thought that it could be interpreted that Samuel Sewell was trying to hold his community accountable for any of the crimes that were happening. But again, that topic is very nuanced, and we also only have one quote from him, but I still think that's one way to interpret it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this shows a 1921 Washington Times article, which talks about a meeting at the AME church where the Colored Veteran Unit will finish planning for their involvement in the Armistice Day funeral procession. And Samuel Sewell actually led the Colored Veterans Unit in the funeral. So he was organizing the Armistice Day procession like the week of November 9th, and the procession took place on November 11th. And so about a week before that, as Asan mentioned, Hattie Sewell lost the concession to the teahouse, and that was on October 31st, 1921. So we found that interesting that while Hattie was sadly losing the teahouse that she worked so hard for, Samuel was leading an army unit in the Armistice Day funeral. So I just think it's really interesting, the contrast of what was happening within their family. So that is what we know about Samuel and Hattie Sewell. And I just think it's important to note that their legacy is still there when you walk the streets of DC, whenever you visit Rock Creek Park or the mill, and even like when you're on U Street. Like Black people's efforts to survive and build something for themselves and for the community, their families, despite so many things being against them, despite their country being against them. And so I think it's really important for all of us to just think about that as we inhabit DC or wherever we're at, and just think about what came before you and how we can honor that. Especially since there's still similar injustices that happened to Hattie and Samuel that Black people face today. So as you can see, everything is connected, and I just think that's something we can all reflect on. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanava. And when we first found out this information that less than 2 weeks after Hattie Soul lost the contract to run the tea house in October of 1921, that just less than 2 weeks after, her husband Samuel Soul was helping to organize this procession on Armistice Day. And this photo that you see right here, this is actually the coffin bearing the first unknown soldier to the tomb of the unknown soldier. So he is a patriotic veteran and served this country with honor. And at the same time, his wife was losing the contract to run the tea house. I did want to give everybody some information about what we have coming up this fall. We are going to be hopefully doing an event at the mill where we're going to expand on the great research that Asan and Yanava have already started to create a short film about Hattie Sewell's life. I think, as you can see, there are many rich connections between Hattie Sewell, Samuel Sewell, and the time and place in which they lived. And we're hoping to create a short film that we can premiere at the mill, if all the stars align, on September 10th, which is a Friday evening at the mill. And so we'll be premiering that film about Hattie Soul then. But part of this project is to get some public feedback. So I hope that if folks have questions, I hope to answer them. I did want to tell folks one little last bit of information about Hattie Soul, sort of what happened next to her after she lost the tea house in 1921. And that is, we did find out that she was able to open another business in October of 1922 at the Balfour, which is at 16th and U. So she opened a cafe there. But there is much more to the story, things that happened before and after the events that we talked about this evening. And I do hope that folks will come back and that we can see you at Peirce Mill. But in the meantime, I would love to hear your questions. Part of the purpose of tonight's event is to get audience feedback and to hear what people would like to know more about. So I welcome your questions and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Angela, we have a couple of questions that have come in that maybe are questions to answer now, or maybe are research to do before September.
Yep.
And first, actually, before I answer ask the questions on behalf of our participants. I want to thank Dr. Yeboah, Asan, and Yanava. That was truly tremendous. And I know how much work has gone into this. So thank you all so very much. And we'll continue to thank you throughout the evening. So just a small aside, one of our participants apparently lives in the building that the Balfour Cafe is in, and would love to know more about that. So, but that's maybe a different topic for a different time. There was a question about the tea house itself. One person would like to know if it was actually in the mill where the mill operations are, or if it was separate. And there was also just a question about, you know, what tea culture would it be like going, I see someone from Teaism is with us today. Would it be a similar experience to going to Teaism today? Or, you know, what was it like? What was the food like? What was tea culture like?
I can take the question about the mill, but then I'll turn things over to Asan because she knows more about tea culture. So the tea house was inside the mill. The machinery of the mill was no longer working. We don't have any photographs of the inside from this time period. We do have some newspaper descriptions from the 1920s. And later, after Hattie Sewell's time period, they did build an addition onto the mill on the water wheel side, sort of a screened-in porch, but that only lasted a few years. And then when the Great Depression came along and the Works Progress Administration, Peirce Mill became one of the first restoration projects, and the mill was rehabilitated in the mid-1930s. So the tea house was, in fact, inside the mill. But for more about tea culture, Asan, would you like to take that question about what we know about tea culture?
Yes, so when I began researching, my research was particularly on this subject. When it comes to the research that I did find, there is one article that is very influential, if you would like to look it up, called African Americans in Tea Room by Jan Whitaker. And I'll put that in the chat once I finish talking. Basically, what I found is that African American tea rooms very much mirrored traditional British tea rooms in that it is very quaint. You were served tea. You were to talk and be very, it's a formalized setting where you were allowed to talk about political issues, the times of the day. Like I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, the difference comes in with African American tea rooms and who was able to access it. Tea rooms in general were ran by women. So most of the tea rooms that you will see will be the hosts will be women, the business owners will be women, because it was one of the areas in which women were allowed to operate a business. However, in terms of African American ownership of tea rooms, both men and women were allowed to frequent these tea rooms in the case, and that's what I found. And in addition to males and females being able to come into the tea houses, you also see a lot of political groups acting, whether that be the NACW, which is the National Association for Colored Women, or Phyllis Wheatley's the YWCA, I believe that is, and but different other organizations. Even the NAACP meetings for local chapters could be held at these tea rooms. So you see a lot of different people coming through the tea room in order to propel African Americans into the future. And when you look at African American tea rooms, it's also important to be aware that respectability politics were one of the parts of the atmosphere, both socially and politically, in terms of propelling African Americans into American culture. And I want to be very careful in the way that I phrase it, because not all African Americans participated in respectability politics. It's very much a middle class, a part of the middle class culture, let's say that. And so that means that we must present and act a certain way in society in order to be accepted. And so the tea house, because it is British, because it is like a white American tradition, was also inhabited by African Americans as a way of, again, fitting in the culture, but still we had our own distinct And in terms of service, one of the things that Angela, Yanava, and I talked about early on is that food culture within the tea houses is very different, where you would see cucumber sandwiches in a white American tea house. In a African American tea house, you would see chicken and waffles being served and things of that nature. And so culturally, the actual mechanism that the tea house was supposed to do is similar, but the way that they act out is very much in line with the differences between the cultural traditions of each side of the coin.
Thank you, Yanava. And I did want to elaborate on something that Asan just talked about, and that is that the Peirce Mill Tea House most likely was segregated. We were fortunate to have John DeFerrari on our board, and he's written a book about historic DC restaurants. There isn't a lot of information, like you can't find a place where it says which restaurants were segregated and whom they served. But based on John's research, we believe that the Peirce Mill Tea House was a segregated establishment. So thank you very much, Asan.
Angela, this is a bit of a follow-up, but there was a question about whether there would have been a dress code or standards at the tea house, the way other tea rooms require, gloves and hats and jackets.
I don't know. That's a really good question.
I'll answer that a little bit. I think it's a good question, and the choice to, can you eat, let's say, fried chicken with white gloves on? Possibly can't, even a fork and knife. So it gives a sense of the politics of you coming to a space like this, being on the tea house from the outside is one thing, then what happens in the inside is something different. So us not having possibly pictures of what it looks like in the inside shows some sense of distinct culture that as Black people, we could own and operate a tea house. But what happens on the inside is something secretive, because it's different than what happens in traditional. So in many cases, we don't have pictures, we don't know, but what we do know is the fact that we don't know says that there's something different happening than what's normalized. And if people did see it, they probably stop us even faster, but we don't say anything. And we leave and enter looking like the same thing is happening, but it's not. Just be able to create a safe space, right? Because again, the space is very, charged racially, that we just come in and out and try to share in the social unity of this being a public space. And the question is, who's the people? So if I'm considered a citizen, I can share in it however which way I own it, but we know that even that is very highly political. So I just want to add that to the sense of, even though it may look like a tea house, it's inside, it's really a secret, political, socially charged space, that what happens outside is different what happens inside.
Yeah, and just to add to what Dr. Yeboah said, we don't know if Peirce Mill, we assume that it served a white clientele, but we also don't know that, because that's also something that would not have been written down. So we're still trying to find out more.
There was a question about whether there might be a relationship between Samuel Sewell's activism and the decision to not renew the tea house concession, if that could have had ramifications for Hattie's work.
That's a good question. Yanava, do you want to try to take that one? That's a big question.
Yeah, that is a good question. That is a possibility. We don't know for sure, but given the context of the time in America's history, it's a very real possibility and very likely that it was due to racism and sexism, because she was a Black woman. I mean, even in DC, Wilson who increased segregation and, tried to revert any Black gains that were made. And then you also have increased racial tensions with the war, Red Summer, things like that. So I think it's safe to assume that it could be maybe not related.
Yeah, and to add to that, to see that she moved somewhere else to do something different so quickly, a lot of the historical legacy of turnover and employment shows that when people see a little bit of smoke, they just pack up and go somewhere because it could be fire. So the fact that she got one complaint is a hint that, okay, let me not you know, find the other trouble here, I'll go somewhere else and just do the same thing. And a lot of African Americans are moving businesses, are moving their clubs from different buildings to buildings. So they're used to just repeated either verbal harassment, that they don't want to escalate something physical or violent, that, okay, one complaint, I'll just go somewhere else. And it could be socially related.
And we also don't know, just sort of add on to the answer to that question, if Samuel Sewell's, the fact that he was in the Army, Rock Creek Park was managed by the Army Corps of Engineers at this time. So we don't know if his military service played any role in her coming to the tea house in the first place. Unfortunately, the National Archives have been closed due to COVID, so some of these things we've been unable to answer. We're hoping that they reopen over the summer so we can look for some of the answers to these questions.
That's fantastic. So thinking about that decision-making process, we have a question about E.S. Newman and why his voice was so strong in that decision-making process, like why it mattered so much to the Park Service or the Army Corps.
I can answer from a Peirce Mill standpoint, and then Asan, if you'd like to add to it. I mean, so E.S. Newman was, he was married to a descendant of the Peirce family, and he lived just up the hill at a mansion called Cloverdale. And so he was a prominent member of the community and a Peirce family member. As far as we know, and this is in the official Rock Creek Park administrative history, he was the only person who complained about Hattie Sewell's management of the tea house. But because he was prominent, Colonel Sherrill, who was the manager of Rock Creek Park at the time, this is before, of course, the National Park Service managed the park. At first, he sort of resisted the pressure from E.S. Newman, and then he gave in. And we also know that after Hattie Sewell lost the contract, there was an effort to make sure that the tea house contract went to the kind of group they thought it should go to, which ended up being the Girl Scouts. Asan, would you like to add anything about E.S. Newman or about the TS contract?
The only thing that I probably would add about the E.S. Newman one was that in my mind, E.S. Newman might have made the complaint, but E.S. Newman was also probably the voice for others who had made the complaint as well. And because he had some foothold, and I wish we could have the picture where we saw how he's connected, because you can kind of see how far off it is. He's still connected. He's still a descendant and in-law. However, it's just interesting that it was interesting to me that she bought the property on a known plantation, because if it's a rather large one, then you know what atmosphere you're buying it in. I think, as Dr. Yeboah said, she was very much prepared to lose the tea house. I don't think that the comment shook her to the core in the way that we might have, and the way we might conceptualize it, because of her awareness of the atmosphere, which further goes to the whole comments on her, the bravery that it took for her to even establish, to even go out there and gain that federal contract on a known plantation, on a known ex-plantation. But it's not out of character for E.S. Newman to have made the complaint. And like I said, in terms of that complaint, I don't think he was the only person who made it. I think he had the position in terms of his positionality against Peirce Mill and his place in that legacy of what it was to have made the complaint and for it to have meant something.
And Asan makes a good point there that Hattie Soul was not from DC, so she might not have, she had only recently arrived here a few years earlier. So she might not have known when she took on the contract to run the tea house at Peirce Mill. She might not have known the history of this particular site. Oops, Jeannie, you're muted.
Thank you, Angela. And all following on that comment about the the plantation, we had a couple of questions and or comments about the history of Peirce Mill as a plantation and the way in which the Park Service, so maybe this is a question for the park, the way in which the Park Service interprets that history, and whether there are any plans to honor or spotlight both Hattie as well as the 26 slaves that were, or people that were enslaved on the property.
This sounds like a question for Dana, if you are on the line, Dana.
I think we
Or-
have Julia
Or
too.
Julia, if Julia is on the line, whoever would like to take.
Do you have a preference, Julia?
Dana, you can go ahead and I'll bring up the rear.
Okay. All right. So we are currently in the process of reviewing our outdoor exhibits at Rock Creek Park, and specifically in multiple locations, and also in including Peirce Mill. And so we are looking at telling more details, obviously more of the history of that site, to include the enslaved people who worked there. In addition to that, we're working with the Friends of Peirce Mill on putting together a web page that will highlight Hattie Sewell on our people page for Rock Creek Park as well. So just a heads up that those things are coming, among other changes as well.
And I would just add that, Rock Creek Park is dedicated now to, our staff is dedicated now to telling a more complete story. And as we work with our friends and uncover more history, we'll be able to add to the repertoire of stories that we tell, either through exhibitry or through personal programs or through the internet. It's very definitely a priority for us moving forward.
Absolutely.
And I'll just add that because the enslavers were compensated upon emancipation, we do have quite a bit of information about the people who were enslaved at Peirce Mill. And that is something that we hope to be able to share going forward.
Mhm.
Thank you. And Dana Dirks is the Chief of Interpretation at Rock Creek Park and a bunch of other things. And Julia Washburn is the Superintendent of the park, and we're delighted to have them with us this evening. Angela, there was a comment that maybe we could just spotlight a little bit of the history that others may not know about. It says Lieutenant/Colonel, maybe he got a promotion, Cheryl, and the role he had in segregating parts of the park, and maybe just the treatment in general of the National Park Service in terms of segregation.
Would someone from the Park Service like to take on this question, or should I?
Do you want to go ahead and catch that one, Julia?
So I don't know that history in depth yet and well enough to answer the question completely, but I would open it to my colleagues. Anyone who's been doing this research, you're welcome to speak up.
Yeah, I think it's, part of what we're trying to do is to learn more in detail about some of the history, and some of, this time of, given that we've had COVID in the more recent past, some documents are not as readily accessible to us as they might have otherwise been. And so, yes, we're continuing to learn more about that history. That, of course, would have been before this was a national park. And so even though it was set aside as a national park in advance, as early as 1890, there was a board of control that was responsible for management of the park at that time.
I will say that historically, Rock Creek Park, both geographically and politically, has been used as a segregation line for Northwest DC. And we see that very clearly today as well, looking at demographic data on the east and west side of the park, as well as other kinds of data like heat mapping and access to green space, et cetera. So it's definitely an area that we are pursuing, and that is why we love partnering with our friends, as well as organizations such as Howard University, to help us dig down and learn this history, and then be able to tell it in a coherent and effective manner.
Yeah. And I will say, just read Colonel Cheryl, that we do know that after Hattie Sewell lost the teahouse contract, as I mentioned earlier, there was a concerted effort to find to not make it an open bidding process. And as Julia and Dana and everyone in the Park Service knows, because they're the federal government, things are supposed to be fair, and they're not supposed to try to, steer business toward a particular contractor, in this case, the Girl Scouts. So it's clear that at least on that level, he did not follow the rules in trying to find a new contractor to run the tea house. And as I said earlier, I hope that we can find out more, find those original letters once the National Archives reopen. But thank you so much, Julia.
Well, we're really honored to have friends like the Friends of Peirce Mill and the Rock Creek Conservancy, and we love working with you, and you are definitely helping to catapult us forward into the 21st century and to really do a more equitable approach to our interpretation, and looking at making sure that the park is welcoming for all people, and that we use perhaps the legacy of segregation and the legacy of racism as a platform for actually bringing people together. And the park shouldn't be a separating line down in the middle of Washington, D.C. It should be common ground. It should be public space. It should be a place for bringing people together. And that is what our goal is and what we hope to strive for as we move forward.
It's nice we can bring people together on Zoom, but I hope to bring people together in actual Rock Creek Park someday soon.
Yes.
Well, on that note, Angela, I know you have some plans at the Peirce Mill in the fall, but starting next Thursday, every Thursday evening, we will be just outside of the Carter Barron for just fun. So it's a great opportunity to come and just talk amongst ourselves. We're getting lots of compliments for all the wonderful information and program that has been shared. So thank you all. There was a question in here. Somebody asked about if there was any more information about the tea house guests specifically, and or their roles in the community more generally, like who was going to the tea house.
There was at least one president, and now I think it was Taft, but someone is going to correct me maybe in the chat. I'm sure there's someone who will correct me in the chat. There was at least one president who visited the Peirce Mill Tea House. So that was a very, yes.
We Hattie Soul was.
No, this was a different era. I'll have to get the correct information on that, but I know at least one president visited the tea house.
Gotcha. John DeFerrari commented Harding waffles, so maybe it's Harding.
Yes. Well, and also as John actually, Harding, who was the president, became president in 1920. His wife was famous for her waffles, Florence Harding, and she was when the Girl Scouts took over the tea house shortly right after Hattie Sewell's time there. They served Harding waffles based, I guess, on Mrs. Harding's recipe, and you can find that online too. So.
But presumably not chicken and waffles.
No, we don't know what she served with her waffles. But anyway.
We had a question about how common this was, whether throughout the district, in the park, was this sort of injustice a frequent thing or a one-off?
Dr. Yeboah, would you like to maybe try that one?
I think to answer the question, how frequent is frequent, I don't know that answer, but the sense of stability around business, around employment, around housing for African Americans in parts of DC, there was a lot of turnover. Definitely a lot of turnover, and a lot of fears around stereotypes of what happens when, let's say, a Black person moves into a space that isn't predominantly Black, we put someone else out, and then someone else may come over. So definitely the sense of in certain markets, again, labor, housing, and business, we do see a high turnover in isolated areas that are not predominantly African American in DC.
Thank you. The comments are shifting from questions to mostly just praise for the amazing content and presentation. There was a request for an email to be able to share information with the Hattie Sewell Project. So Angela, I can put your contact in the chat if you'd like. Thank you. And we'll make sure that the resources that have been shared are included in the Conservancy. We'll send a thank you to everybody for participating with a link to the recording and also, when we eventually get it up with audio descriptions, we'll share that, and we'll make sure that Angela's contact in there is included. Oh, we did just get another. Were waffles at the time similar to waffles now, or was there anything special about waffles in Hattie Sewell's world? What did they look like, or maybe taste like?
I assume that they were regular waffles. I've looked at Mrs. Harding's waffle recipe. It looks pretty familiar to me. Asan has done some thinking on sort of the symbolism or the meaning of the food though itself. Would you like to take on the waffle question?
Yeah, so to answer that specific question, waffles would have looked very similar to how they look now. Waffles aren't traditionally American cuisine. They are European cuisine that get transported to America. And so they traditionally will look like the average waffle, what it would look like, not Eggo waffles or the bubble waffles that they put ice cream in, but what you would see if you would look at an advertisement is pretty much. And one of the ways that I kind of approach that question in my own research is just going back through food advertisements, actually. And later on, when we do the big presentation, we're going to have a section in there about the historical importance of food. Anybody who does historical research will understand that food holds a big cultural understanding. And when me and Angela were talking about it, I actually had referred to a TV series on Netflix, which goes over, called Ugly Delicious. It goes over the importance of chicken within the African American community, the ideal of chicken and waffles, and how, yes, it was served at her tea house, but it also holds a history of both stereotypical African American foods, but also this is what we eat because of the historical legacy of what foods we were allowed. And so it's very important when we talk about chicken and waffles. It's not a minute fact within the story. It's actually a very important aspect because we're talking about racial division and Aunt Jemima. And as we know today, they just changed that picture of Aunt Jemima because of what the Mamie picture that it presents. So her serving chicken and waffles was something that both interested us as a team, but also interested us for as many negative reasons as it was for positive reasons. And so we're still trying to discover that, and we'll put the comprehensive background on that in the bigger presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Asan.
Angela, I think we have exhausted our questions.
Awesome. Well, wonderful.
So I now know what I'm having for dinner.
Yeah. So do feel free to share my email address, because I really would love to hear feedback on this presentation. You can also find the Friends of Peirce Mill on Facebook. I would love to hear what people think, what they're interested in learning more about as we work over the summer, Asan, Yanava, and I, to create a short film about Hattie Sewell and her life and her times. And we've been so happy to thank you so much for joining us this evening and for helping us to share this story. And thank you so much, Asan and Yanava and Dr. Yeboah, for sharing your time with us and your insight on this project. I just feel so privileged to have you all working with us on this project. So thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Angela, I would like to thank you and the Friends of Peirce Mill for the vision to put this project together and for being so generous with your time here. On behalf of the Conservancy, would like to thank Dr. Yeboah and Yanava and Asan and congratulate you on your recent graduation. I think we a round of applause for that. Fantastic. We will be delighted to share more information about this program as well as other programs in the Race History and Rock Creek series. The next one is June 23rd. It will be a exploration of the history of the Summer in the Parks programming, which was a late 60s innovation. And I'm delighted to share that Sugar Bear from Experience Unlimited is going to be joining us for that. So it's going to be pretty awesome. Maybe not quite as awesome as this one. It is really exciting to see the work that has gone into this, but also to hear Julia, Dana, and the rest of our colleagues at the National Park Service talk about their vision for interpretation of these places and stories for the future. And we're incredibly grateful to you all for the hard work that we know that entails, as well as the openness to that vision. So thank you for that. Thank you everyone for being here. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Maybe one final round of applause for the Friends of Peirce Mill and our colleagues at Howard for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad we didn't have to follow Sugar Bear.
I think it'll be a tough act to follow, but you have warmed us up well. And like I said, I need to go make some waffles now, and I'm sure everyone else does too. So can't wait to see you all in September too at the mill.
Dana, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just wanted to say on behalf of the National Park Service, thank you, thank you, thank you again to all of the great research that our Howard students and professor have been involved in on this project. And of course to you, Angela, as well. And again, Rock Creek Conservancy for, again, quite regularly jointly co-sponsoring this with us as well. So great presentation. Thank you again so much. And we look forward to seeing the next phases of this project and being part of it.
I want to echo what Dana said and just say, fabulous presentation, very impressive. Thank you, Howard University students and professor. I'm just blown away. It's been a terrific program. So thank you, Friends of Peirce Mill and Rock Creek Conservancy as well.
Great. Well, we hope to see you all on September 10th. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you so much.